so much for joining us. First question that I want to start with was, what challenges do LGBTQ plus scholars and academics face that most people might be unaware of?
I think this is a really important question, and I think it's very contextual based upon how you identify within our community. I think there's a lot of challenges that are unique to particular individuals and then particular identities within the acronym. But I will say for myself that the material realities of what it means to be an academic at the moment, thinking about class and, adjunct and contingent laborers, I think that is something that we are aware of, but I don't know if we're always aware of just how dire it can be for some people who are really struggling. And I think a lot of queer people, based upon their backgrounds, don't have the family support, don't have the kind of generational knowledge and resilience to survive as an academic. There's a really substantial loss that's happening of queer and trans people who have such brilliant ideas and so much to contribute to our fields of knowledge, whatever they might be, who just can't stick it out, who can't struggle year after year trying to get that job, who don't have the family resources to fall back on, who, like myself, as a first generation academic, my family has no idea what it means to be an academic. They don't understand what we do and how we do it, and why aren't you making this much money, and why aren't you in a stable, secure position? All of these things that I think come up for myself and for many people I know who are queer and trans, trying to make a career out of this. Culturally writ large, we're not aware of the sheer brilliance that's being lost because the jobs just aren't there. And I think that that's really sad. I think that we're losing so many people who are going into industry. But I think the academy itself is really losing people for whom this life is not something they were born into, if that's the right way to put it, and is not something that they can have a spouse or have a family or have someone that can just help them get over the hump, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, however many years it might be to be not only in grad school, but then to be on the job market looking for that stable position. The academy, I think we all can agree, has a certain kind of classism and elitism. And I think that queer and trans people often struggle to thrive in ways that are based upon our own identities and backgrounds, but also the kind of institutional systemic realities don't support us. I think challenges for me is really something that a lot of people are going through. Do I stick this out? Do I stay in it? Do I struggle when I don't have the support networks that I know many of my non-queer, non-trans peers and cohorts and colleagues seem to have? And I don't want to make a blanket statement, but many of them don't seem to have the awareness of the lack of support networks that many queer and trans people who decide to become academics and pursue the career, they just don't have to fall back on.
Interesting that you mentioned it, because I was doing an interview earlier today, and the issues of like class and poverty and first generation academics came up as well. It is hard, even if you have a family that wants to support you and they can't, or, if you came out and you kind of lost your family because of that. One of the things we don't talk about enough is how much of a toll emotionally it takes to being in academia, when it's kind of like, well, just go and talk to like your support network, and you don't have one, especially if you're just getting started. Not to say that people who aren't queer don't experience the challenge of not having support, but sometimes there is a little bit something extra that people won't necessarily understand.
I think you're totally right. And that brought up two things for me. One, on the sort of mental health aspect, is it's really hard to struggle and to feel as though your life is so difficult, even if you believe in the work. And so many of my friends, myself included, have therapists, and we have these outlets to people we go talk to for our mental wellness. But not everyone has the resources to pay for that. A huge challenge. I would agree with you there. And then one thing that was kind of before that I just wanted to highlight. So much of my focus and my interest lately is thinking through what it means to be a Southern queer academic. That is so important to my work and who I am. You can't talk about those two things if you're not also talking about class and poverty and what it means to make only a certain amount of money doing something you love and come from minimal resources in terms of your background. And so all of that is informing what I see as a huge challenge right right now, which is the sheer brilliance, as I said, of so many scholars who just do not have the material support to stick this out. I know that there are ways that they can get their work out there that don't involve being an academic in terms of, being a doctor, but also writing and doing all kinds of works or whatever it might be, working in nonprofits, et cetera. But it saddens me a little bit to think that those choices are being made and that we're losing some people just because of material realities.
It also has to take a toll on self-perception, right? And your ability to think of like, well, I can do it, and then not being able to accomplish what you want to do, not because you don't have the abilities, not because you don't have the knowledge or the drive, but because things are kind of outside of your control. Or in an earlier interview, we were talking about how sometimes it's really hard to get funding for research when it has like a queer focus because people don't see the value in it, right? And then it's hard not to take that personal because it's saying your identity isn't valid enough for me to want to give you the money to do something that is going to have a big impact on a lot of people who are oftentimes overlooked.
Resource allocation and where, what grants get funded, what research gets greenlit. I think that is a huge problem, a huge challenge. And I think that there are, depending on the context, real questions to ask about why that's happening. Because I do think in some contexts, it probably is some degree of prejudice or not wanting to fund a queer project. But I can definitely see that happening. I see it happening every day.
Part of that is the fact that there aren't spaces in every discipline for queer people. The next question is about the importance of creating welcoming spaces. And something that's kind of come up over and over again has been the fact that usually it's kind of treated as just like, well, there's an LGBTQ center or club that, first of all, tends to appeal more usually to undergrad. So it's kind of hard to go in as a grad student. It's under the assumption that you're going to have something in common with somebody just because you're part of the queer community. And then it's still kind of marginalizing, right? Because it's then you guys stay over there and that's the queer area. And then there's the rest of campus. So what do you think is the importance of creating these spaces beyond that and more so across the disciplines?
And again, I think this is a really important question. And I think about it a lot, and I don't know what the solution is, but I know that it is important to create these spaces. And I would agree with you that there's a siloing that happens often, the siloing often feels very symbolic, right? You create this center or this space for queer and trans folk, and they can go there and they can do those things, but there's not a lot of bridge work. There's not a lot of that intersectionality happening. There's not a lot of interdisciplinarity happening, as you're saying, because we're not thinking about what it means to be queer and be, in the biology department versus queer in English and American studies versus queer in WGSS, which is what we have it. There needs to be a greater emphasis on the bridge work. There are conversations happening, but there's so much like paper writing. You end up doing the document, I think Sarah Ahmed wrote. You end up doing kind of symbolic gestures, but what's the practical application? Like, how do you actually make this happen? I feel like many of the people who I love and cherish as colleagues understand that this is important to create these welcoming spaces, that they don't need to feel siloed, that we don't want to feel tokenistic. We don't want to feel in any way like we're being made to feel special by being excluded somewhat, like included by being excluded. We don't want those things to be happening. But how can we build bridges across campus? And I don't know. I don't have the solution. One of the forthcoming questions about what particular institutions might be doing. And so I know that there are a few things that are happening at my institution, but I don't know if they're the solution or if there are better solutions. But I do think, of course, it's important. We have this expression in the South, the all means all. I think that we can agree on the value and the ethic of that, but how you go about implementing it, what's the procedure, what's the protocol for making that a reality, are questions that we need to be asking, and we need to be piloting ways to make it happen. Spaces like this, conversations like this is where we start building some of those bridges.
One of the things that stood out when talking about these spaces as well has been the expectation being put on usually like the one queer person in the department, and how that is a lot of unpaid work on top of a lot of other unpaid work that goes on in academia. And the thing is, I was speaking about how that can cause a lot of resentment and put the person in a really uncomfortable position when it's just you against the whole department, right? Being like, hey, I noticed this and it made me uncomfortable, especially if the people around don't really understand what it's like to be in that environment when you're kind of being made responsible for that.
Mhm.
Beyond that, it's also needs to be a community effort, because it's not as great an impact if you specifically in your courses teach queer history or queer
Mhm. Mhm.
literature, or try to incorporate that identity into what you teach, if everyone else is not also incorporating something into their curriculum.
Yeah.
Because then sure, the people who take your class benefit, but then if they don't, they're kind of missing out.
The curriculum needs to represent and be representative across the curriculum in terms of the content that's being taught, who's being taught as, some of the great chemists, for example, who's being, are you teaching Rosalind Franklin, for example, when you're talking about DNA? That's not necessarily queer, but it is a kind of example of the way in which we think about representation, how we narrate the story. But another thing that I just wanted to mention is like of an example of a colleague of mine who I have great admiration for and respect. But I'll never forget, we were discussing a student that we both had. And this student, I happened to know something this student shared with me about their coming out and their struggles and how that journey was happening as they were in college, as they were trying to succeed in coursework. But this colleague friend of mine was not aware of that. And so they made a comment about how the student felt checked out and wasn't really there because I was trying to recommend the student for a particular award. And my colleague was like, oh, well, this student wasn't particularly checked in, wasn't particularly good in my class. And I remember thinking, and I talked with my colleague about some information I had without disclosing particulars about the student. But, I left the conversation thinking that there is a disconnect often that we are not maybe always verbalizing or talking enough about as faculty members in terms of the journeys that queer and trans students are undergoing as they are also involved intellectually learning, as they're pursuing their degrees, etc., that I can be quite sympathetic to and empathetic to. There's an empathy gap that happens between those who don't know that information or aren't perceptive enough to see that something's going on and to kind of resist the knee-jerk judgment of this student is not performing or this student's not doing well. And that really sticks with me. That story I continue to think about because it has invited me to consider that even when that a student may not be queer and trans outwardly identifying to me or not at all, maybe they're, we don't share any identities in terms of who we are as people, that I need to be very vigilantly perceptive of all students, that there is something that each person can bring if they're invited to bring it. And if they don't feel an empathy gap or kind of a judgment happening. If you do outwardly identify, sometimes the kind of onus or a burden is put upon you to kind of represent everyone and do everything. Or you feel a kind of judgment from kind of a disconnect that's happening between you. And that's something I really try to avoid in my work and in my courses is to, again, all y'all, to bring everybody in and learn with.
You mentioned it earlier that you don't always think about what students are going through in their personal lives, regardless of the level, they're at. And there's sometimes a bit of sensitivity or empathy that's kind of lacking there. One of the people I was speaking to earlier was saying that their students really valued being reminded that they belong there. Because I think when you are in that position, when your mind is so consumed by so many things at the same time and you're not performing well, you might instinctively feel like, well, this is not for me, or maybe I should drop out or all that. And sometimes all you really need is somebody to just be like, it's okay, let's take a breather. It's hard to balance, right? Because there is a lot of emotional labor that goes into it that adds a lot to your plate.
Yeah, I mean, I had a student just this past semester have a full-scale emotional breakdown in the hallway right before I had to teach a class. And I just felt so deeply for the student, but I knew, I was like, I have to go in here and teach this class. Like, I have to go do my job. And so I had to walk the student to counseling services and, make sure that they were okay. But I do think there's maybe going back a little bit to the idea of mental wellness. I do think there's so much that's happening in the world that can be so stressful, and that particular populations of people, students, faculty, staff, etc., or maybe not, maybe there's kind of a disconnect happening in terms of what's needed to support those folks.
What do you think administrators, I think especially, because they're kind of the people with the power, right? As professors, there comes a time where you're limited in what you can do. So what do you think, administrators and staff could be doing to just better support the queer community on their campuses?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to where we started, as anti-capitalist as we might want to be, or our values might be, resource allocation, funding. I think think it's really important to fund queer research, to fund queer and trans researchers, no matter what they're studying, if it's queer or trans related, because again, we have to be aware that just because we're queer or trans identifying doesn't mean we study queer and trans subjects. Fund conferences, centers, professional development, all of the things that really build and keep queer and trans staff, faculty in the academy. And if I decide, or whomever might decide, I no longer think this is what I want for my life, it should not be because we can't afford to make this our life. It should be because, we meet someone and we want to move, or, whatever the fact might be in our personal life. One of the other things in terms of curriculum and content, I just kind of wanted to share a story because it happened recently. And it really feels sort of like a metaphor for so much right now. So I had to keep my nephew last week, and I had to keep him for a week while my brother-in-law and my other nephew were out of town and my sister was working. And so they live in Florida. And I think we're living in very uncertain times when it comes to queer and trans curricula. And I think Florida, of course, has become at the top of everyone's list in terms of thinking about don't say gay and all of the ways that we kind of made shorthand of a very complex and dangerous curtailment of what we can do in the classroom at whatever level. And I don't think it's confined to primary education or kind of middle and high school or elementary. I think it has ramifications for our entire educational system. So anyways, I was keeping Henry last week in Florida. And so I had to take him to his school drop off every morning and every evening. I would pick him up. He's doing a summer camp so that I had a few hours in the day to work. And I think it was the second or third day, last Tuesday or Wednesday, that I went to pick him up. I saw this bulletin board, and the bulletin board had a rainbow border, and it was rainbow. And I thought, oh, okay, I don't know if this was for Pride Month that just ended, but I'm imagining it might be. But the bulletin board was empty. It was just black paper, but it had a note in the center that said, please do not take this down, smiley face. And I have no way, I didn't ask administrators, I didn't go ask anyone if this was a Pride bulletin board that had been up, that they're reimagining moving forward from, official Pride Month. But it resonated with me because I thought this is also what administrators need to be standing up and saying. We will not take down queer history. We will not take down off the curriculum, off the reading list, queer and trans subject books that are age appropriate, that are representative, that are there to help people like myself when I was young know that you belong, know that your story matters, that we want to hear it, that you need to keep going. I feel very passionate about this because my nephew who's 5 had no idea why Uncle Eric stopped to take a picture and why he was so moved by this. But it really resonated with me that administrators at all levels, even if it puts you in conflict with your legislature, with your governor, with your elected officials, you need to take a stand. You need to stand up to make these spaces welcoming for everyone, because the forces of that want to take us back, that say we can't teach critical race theory, that want to make a big deal out of all of these academic theories and subjects, they don't understand them, first of all. And second of all, it should be incumbent upon the instructor in consultation with their department and all the other people to teach what is appropriate for the age group and is representative and is, inclusive of everyone. Don't say gay, throw that out the window. Say gay as much as you want to, but don't take it down. Don't remove it. Don't cave to these pressures. Resist. So that for me was something that has really resonated with me recently, in terms of what university administrators and staff can do to support the curriculum and the academics and what we teach. In terms of how we teach, again, financially, I think it's really important in making sure that we have all the things that we need to do our jobs, and that we feel supported as queer and trans people in order to stay in these jobs, that we're not just being invited into these positions for a 1-year contract and, hey, we need to up our diversity, so please come be a queer person on our campus for a year, but then we'll, do something else next year or whatever. I think you need to make an investment in queer and trans researchers and scholars across the curriculum in all departments. Make sure they're welcome, make sure they're supported, make sure the curriculum is representative so that all students can find themselves there.
As you spoke, there were 3 words that came to my mind: representation, allyship, and then kind of moving away from that idea of indoctrination. It's important to have, again, those queer scholars in there. It's important to have the representation in the classroom, in the coursework, because like you said, it's so important, especially for younger people, to see somebody like them in that position. Yes, you can relate to somebody on many levels, but when you see somebody who expresses something and you're like, oh my god, it's not just me, I think that gives you hope, and I think it makes you feel like I can do that. If every single class you go into, you have every single professor looks exactly the same, I don't think you're going to feel encouraged or feel like you'd even belong. The previous interview, we talked about the difference between inclusion versus being comfortable, right? You can be included in something, but you can feel really uncomfortable in that room. And I think that's where allyship comes in, right? It's not being like, okay, only the queer people need to fight for the things that they want. It's we need people to back everyone up.
Yeah, and I think allyship is so important. As you were speaking just now, I thought, bridges work in multiple directions. We want people to be allies of the queer work that we do, of the queer people we are, even when it might be uncomfortable for them. And we must ask ourselves how we can be better allies of people whose work we want to support, that we believe in, our values align with, but may not be like us, look like us, believe like us, etc. One of the most rewarding teaching experiences was teaching on the work of James Baldwin. And that course, even as the professor, made me uncomfortable in numerous times. Baldwin's work is meant to make you uncomfortable. There were instances where we had uncomfortable conversations that we grew from, that I had to learn how to navigate and pivot and think with and think through with students. And I think that's really important while we're on Baldwin. Great Baldwin quote about reading, something to the effect of, how do you deal with your pain and your heartbreak? And he says something like, it was books that taught me that everything that I've experienced that was painful and heartbroken, someone else has experienced before. And it made me feel less alone. And I think that in many ways, that is the encapsulation of representation and why it matters. Because you need to be able to see yourself in the classroom, in the curriculum, in the content. You need to be able to understand that you belong and that you matter and that you can deal with these things because of the fact that you can connect through the page or through the classroom space.
David Foster Wallace said that good literature is made to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. That's almost what we need to do in academia, right? I'm going to draw attention to this thing. And I know you don't want to see it because it makes you uncomfortable. And that's why we don't talk about it. But if we don't talk about it, then it's never going to really change. Going back to like the welcoming spaces, it's about opening those doors so that people can be like, hey, this is a serious problem.
Question everything. Be critically thinking and questioning everything.
How do you think that being an LGBTQ plus academic informs the way that you research, write, and teach?
Ultimately, it informs everything I do. It informs who I am. In that regard, it's inseparable from what I teach, what I write, what I research. The queer analytic, as I understand it, is a verb. It's something you do. And so I do it in every way, shape, form, in everything that I do. So for me, my book I'm working on is titled Queer Straight. So queer is in the title, and it merges my work in queer studies and Southern studies, cultural history in the queer imagination. The tour project is a digital mapping story tour project of Atlanta. So sites in the built environment of Atlanta's queer past specifically. And so that is obviously informed by queerness and what it means to be queer. It speaks to my understanding that the central thrust of queer studies is validating and recognizing the dignity of queer lives in often oppressive environments. I also want to say, though, queerness informs who I am and everything that I do, but it's not the only thing. And I think that sometimes we can get so deeply specialized and thinking about the work that we do that we lose the sort of interdisciplinary and intersectional focus and that bridge work I was mentioning earlier. It was really important to me when I started editing a series for the journal Southern Spaces a few years ago that it was called Queer Intersections, because I wanted people to feel invited from various disciplines and from various identifications to submit work. So much of my teaching has actually been structured using the intersectional analytic. So I teach a course called Queer Intersections. I teach American Intersections, which is a introductory American Studies course. My writing course is very sociological in dimension in terms of the subjects and themes that we traverse together in our reading and then writing about those themes. Queerness is so central to who I am and what I do, but as I think you've probably gathered, so is being Southern, so is being cisgender, so is being, of a lower socioeconomic status background, so is being, a white person in a world in which white supremacy is rampant and still with us and still producing an unspeakable acts of violence on the daily. So there's so much that good and bad that makes up my identity that I try to bring into my work. Queerness is both everything and not everything, but it's been very central to everything that I've written and researched so far, for sure.
And I think that's essential, right? Treating them as a whole person and not just like I see you as this and only this.
I think I would say that queerness, it informs everything that I do. I feel as though, I kind of default to the queer analytics so much in my work that I sometimes have to, zoom back out and think about and how, as someone who studies literature and text and films and novels, etc., how can I zoom back out and go, I'm reading this queerly because that's what I have been trained to do. That's what all the queer theory reading I've done, that's where I go. But how can I zoom back out and go, what is this text saying about race? Or what is this text saying about class experience? So thinking, kind of sociologically again, what's happening in these other, in reading this a little bit differently. Because queerness, of course, is not just about sexuality or gender identity, but the queer analytic often lends itself to thinking about text in a certain kind of way that I have to kind of pull myself back out and go, what would a deconstructionist say about this text, for example? How can I think a little bit different?
That's the wonderful thing about literature, right? Is that there are so many ways to grab a text and interpret it and allow for different identities merge and meet in one place, create a bridge, as you have very well said. I think, beyond that, then, well, both academics and professionals, but also just students, how do you think that they can feel empowered through writing and kind of develop that voice?
But empowering voice, I really do believe in, the kind of neo-expressivist model. So I love Peter Elbow's work. I will be an expressivist till the day I die. And I think there's something so powerful in claiming voice, helping students to claim that voice, to find it, claim it, write it, put it into communication, oral and written. And so I do think that that's central to everything that I do, the kind of structure of assignments I have. I begin with a personal narrative essay always, just because I want to hear your voice more than I want to know how you write or how well you write or any of those sort of diagnostic things. I want to kind of get a sense of who you are and your voice as a writer. So the expressivist tradition is definitely very important to me because it allows me to kind of get a window into the writer, into the identity, into the person that I can then build off of in terms of something else that's really important to me, which is exigence, and thinking about, what is urgent, what is demanding of you as a person to write right now. I try to encourage students to find the why I write. So I build my courses around that principle, and we read kind of various why I write manifestos throughout the semester. And the first one we read is from, a really famous one by Joan Didion. And one of the things that I love that she says in that piece is, that writing is an impositional act. And so I do this thing where I take a book and I kind of throw it on an empty desk in the front of the classroom and say, this is one of the things that Joan Didion is telling us about the practice of writing, that everything that you write is an impositional act because you are literally writing it and inviting an audience, inviting someone to read it. It's both invitational and impositional. And so you have to bring yourself to it, because if you're going to impose on someone's space and ask them to write it, make it you. Make it something where you can be in it no matter the rhetorical context. If it's a lab report or whatever, there's always a way in which you can use the structure, the context to make it meaningful for you and for your reader. I hope that that idea of making all writing context meaningful is empowering to LGBTQ plus students, because I think that if you feel as though I am empowering you to write about whatever feels urgent for you to write about, that you will then find ways to write about those topics in meaningful ways across disciplines in all contexts, that you will continue to do that after you've left the four walls of my classroom at the end of the semester. Speaking of Reginald Shepard, the Why I Write Manifesto, as I call it, that we end on every semester in that class, is his, in which he writes in that piece. It's one of my favorite ones. It's so beautifully meaningful. I don't know if you know Reginald Shepard, but he was a Black queer HIV positive poet and lived at the end of his life in Pensacola, Florida. And I love this piece because it really talks about how writing is, a document that lives on beyond you. And he says he writes because he wants to live forever. And he writes because he wants to save himself and others from drowning. And it's quite, deep and heavy note to end on. But in these last few years of everything that we've lived through with COVID, et cetera, with just the sheer amount of loss and grief that many people are going through, I hope that that is also empowering for students of all backgrounds and of all identities to know that writing is something that both helps you claim your identity, it both helps you claim your personhood, helps you express your personhood, but also helps you document it for those who come after you to know, as we've been saying, to read in a future syllabus, hey, this person was here, this person was like me, this person led a meaningful life and produce something beautiful out of it so that I can, build off of that. So, there's an intergenerational ethic there too, I guess, to what I do. But I just think writing can empower everyone. But I think for queer and trans people, so much of our stories can be difficult and, a life of struggle, and writing out that struggle into some form of communication can be therapeutic, it can be expressivistic and all those things, but I think it can also just really be beautiful, produce something beautiful out of the struggle.
I love that model, right? Because that's the conversation I have so often with students at the writing center is they'll come in and they're always like, I don't know how to make this sound smart. And it's because they kind of feel like they need to fit a mold of like my opinion and my background and everything that makes me needs to be entirely suppressed, and I need to write the way this journal article I read for research is written. And so many times it not only suppresses their voice, but it makes them feel like they don't belong. And I think that's why it's also so important to continue adding diverse voices, right? Because so many students are going to benefit from being able to read, more modern and diverse voices, and being able to be like, okay, this is me, and they'll be more passionate about it, right? If you're reading like War and Peace, it's kind of hard to relate to War and Peace.
I think that so much of writing still, the way we perceive writing and the kind of instruction of writing is that you remove the self. You remove the self as much as possible to produce so-called good academic writing is the removal of self. And, one of the things I try to bring my students back to, especially in the composition classroom, is if we think about, I call it the rhetorical envelope in my class, author, audience, topic, purpose, one of those is author, right? Like one of those is you, if you are the writer in that situation. So don't remove yourself because you don't know if that's the right method for that particular piece. You might know in the third draft or the fourth draft how much of the first person, for example, or how much of your own narrative you should include in that particular piece. But I agree with you. I have so many students who come to me and I don't want to include first person. I don't want my story anywhere in here, but I don't know how to start writing this without that. I'm like, well, then we need to start with that. Write your way into it. Tell your story about, this particular subject. If we're doing a close reading of a book, for example, of a short story, write in first person I think this book is about XYZ, blah, blah, blah. Then we can start turning that into whatever, the situation might call for. If your particular professor says, do not use first person, well, there's a fairly, easy way to convert that from, being I think to another phrase that's not going to be frowned upon by your professors. I mean, that's why my course is called Why I Write. That's why I is such an important pronoun throughout the semester for me in our assignments, and the way I structure it is I really want students to understand who they are and why why they're writing about the topics that they choose to write about, because they're given a lot of choice in my classes. I really want them to own those and feel empowered and encouraged to bring all of who they are to the table and to the page.
It also gives them that relevance. But, a lot of people who study other things are like, oh, God, why do I need to take composition classes? And I think being able to make it relevant to them and being like, tell your story and share your perspective.
You just can't make assumptions about students based on identities or, majors or where they're coming from or their backgrounds. And so creating space for them to bring whoever they are, whatever they're studying, into the classroom is I think, really important. In a particularly queer context, thinking about queer students, that invitation to bring themselves to the table, to bring all of who they are into the classroom space, sometimes especially in a freshman comp class, that's going to be the first time that they have been invited to bring all of who they are into writing spaces and writing situations. And that's something, as a queer boy who grew up in the Mississippi Delta, that I'm keenly aware of. Some of the most surprising moments I've had is when I get that first essay from a student who I had no idea was, I guess, in the family, as we might say. And, to learn that they've had this struggle and they were comfortable enough to feel empowered to write about and express those aspects of who they are is really rewarding. And I think that's one of the most important ethical things that composition and writing can offer all students in any discipline, is the ability to say, this is a writing assignment. If it's not like a lab report or a particular genre, if it's something that's a little bit more free form, you should feel invited and encouraged and empowered to bring all of who you are to it. And so I think that writing the narrative mode especially, offers students and everyone that invitation.
I think it invites students who aren't there yet, aren't ready to be open to be like, I have somewhere to put this because my professor's going to read it. It's not like blog post or something that everyone's going to know. I think it gives them that opportunity to start finding that voice and start finding that identity and playing with it and exploring it.
Yeah, I think writing is questioning. Writing is a way of thinking, as Joan Didion says. You don't often know what you're thinking until you write it down and you kind of work your way through. And so that can be about particular topics, but it can also, obviously, as you're saying, be about the self. You don't know what you're thinking about, where you are and who you are and your situation, until you write it out and write it down. If students feel that invitation, no matter the context, no matter the discipline, no matter the class, I think that is so empowering and so important. And I think writing really does offer that, and it can offer that.
Pivoting to a different direction here.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the misconceptions that people have about being queer in academia? And I think we kind of started touching on this when you were saying that, yes, being queer is part of your identity, but it's not the whole of your identity.
This is not only about being queer. I think we culturally tend to do this about a lot of difference, basically, if I should put it that way, that we kind of make assumptions about what their lives are like or what matters to them. So I think, in terms of the question, one of them, all queer people in academia study queer topics and know queer theory and know the ins and outs of Michel Foucault and Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick and all these great thinkers. I mean, that's something I do and I study, but not everyone does. I have a friend who's a biologist and, outwardly, identifying gay man, and he doesn't know any of this stuff. He may have read it in when he was an undergrad, but he doesn't really study it on the regular. So I think another thing, again, that people tend to do is group all of us together as if all of our experiences are the same. That's kind of going to what you said about like being the one queer person in the department who has to speak for everyone. That's just, not only is it not right, it's not possible. Because sympathetic as I am in my values and in what I believe to, the struggles and the kind of unique particularities and situations and experiences of trans people, that's not my life. And I think sometimes we get grouped into this monolith that is not reflective of reality. And that's a huge misconception, and that's a huge problem, that people need to be more nuanced in their approach and their understanding of what it means to be a lesbian, what it means to be gay, what it means to be queer, what it means to be trans, what it means to be questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, all the different ways that we think about who we are as a collective have very unique manifestations in the world. So I think that, don't make a assumption about someone because you know that the gay professor in the department does this, and so this is what the lesbian professor is going to do. That's not only is it not fair, it's not realistic. But one of the things I did want to touch on, I don't know if I have all the right ways of putting this, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about, the kind of buzzword professionalism and kind of that rhetorical delivery of that word and what it might mean when it comes to queer and trans people. Sometimes that gets used and deployed as like you're not being professional, but within that is kind of a homophobia, transphobia, prejudice that's happening about the way people dress or the way people conduct themselves or the topics people study. This came up for me once when I wrote a piece about geospatial locating apps like Grindr and Scruff and all of that. And someone who I admire quite a lot said that I was brave for writing that piece. And I thought, what does that mean? That seems like shade to me, that you thought it's not a very professional topic to write about or something. And so I think there's a kind of disconnect happening and a misconception between, non-queer identifying, non-trans folks and queer and trans folks in terms of topics we study, what gets funded, the professional kind of decorum protocols that are outdated, that are not realistic for how we live our lives in the real world. That's something that I think generationally is changing in a good way, but so much of the academy is still made up of certain kinds of generations of folks, many of whom are being very open in spirit and are making leaps with us and are, changing, but many of whom are just not. They think that not wearing a tie is unprofessional, or, not dressing in a certain way when you go to an academic conference is unprofessional, or talking about particular topics is not professional. So I think that the question of professionalism when it comes to queer and trans folks is one that I've been thinking a lot about and will continue to think through. And I think it has a lot to do with misconceptions that happen from people who are not, as it were, in the family, and people who are, the kind of divide that happens between those two things.
So much of how we present ourselves is judged, I would say, unnecessarily. And I think so much of it is, as you said, these very antiquated ideas of what you're supposed to look like. And I think that also tends to shut down a lot of people and make them feel that they don't belong, and discourages them because you're like, well, I don't express myself a certain way, or I don't, present a certain way. I know I've definitely experienced it. I'm a very eloquent writer. Do not make me do any public speaking because I'm like, it's not going to happen.
So I get so nervous at conferences. I'm a performer and, have been, in various plays, and that makes me nervous too. But I also get really nervous when I go to a conference and I know what I'm talking about. I have the paper ready, but I get really nervous. So yeah. I do think there's, and that's another kind of layer that can result in, misunderstanding and misconceptions of people and their work. Yeah, I think there's so much external gatekeeping, right? That's kind of what we're talking about with professionalism, right? There are people that are trying to keep certain people out or trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong from those outside of yourself. But again, equally, as you're saying, there's this kind of internal, imposter syndrome kind of voice that's telling you, am I doing this? Should I be doing this? Or should I be saying this? Or did I come across the right way? And I think academia needs to think about, and by academia, I mean all of us in it, because it's not just this entity. Yeah. I think we all need to think about what is it that makes us kind of think about authenticity. Like, what are we trying to be? Like, why can't we be who we are, whole people, everything, comfortable in making mistakes, in not saying the right thing, in being nervous, and, not wearing the right thing for everybody. Like, all of those things, I think, are what makes us human. And I think that as humanities scholars in particular, I think that should be really important to us. We own that. We encourage the kind of full humanity of ourselves.
And also just encouraging, right, those topics that I think so many times we're so scared to talk about or write about. We're also missing out in people leaving academia, but even the ones who stay, in them not being able to write about the things that they actually are passionate about, because it's not like marketable, or somebody's not going to want to publish it in their journal or whatever. And then it's asking, okay, well, why not? What is the difference?
There's a difference between being disrespectful and being someone who is going to really challenge and provoke. I don't think that we should tolerate outright blatant disrespect in our classrooms and our academic situations. But one of the most rewarding and meaningful teaching evaluations, if you will, that I've ever received came from a student, not anonymously, who came up to me on the last day of class. And, she said to me, "Thank you, Dr. Solomon. This is the only class I've taken this semester where I was not afraid to say something wrong." And I thought, what? That's I was like moved, but I also thought, that's not right. You should not feel like you're being shut down or silenced. We learn by making mistakes, as it were, by making those, as Bob Ross would say, those happy little accidents. We learn and grow from being open and vulnerable to knowing what we don't know and admitting what we don't know and talking out loud and not saying the right thing, as long as it's done respectfully, as long as it's done in the pursuit of knowledge and insight. I think that that's what education should be, right? Like we should be saying the wrong thing so that we can grow. So, you're thinking about the topics that we write about, and not only those leaving the academy, but those who are staying who feel like they can't speak or say what they need to say. I think that that's a challenge in the culture writ large beyond the academy we live in now. Is how can we foster and support the pursuit of insight and knowledge and growth without making people feel as though they can't say what they need to say, that they can't say maybe the wrong thing in order to grow critically and intellectually. I think that that's something that I invite all people of all backgrounds in my classes. Being in the South, I have many conservative leaning people in my courses, and I try to make sure that we have that dialogue, that we build those bridges, and that we maybe not find complete common ground in all ways, but that we have a discussion in which everyone leaves the classroom that day feeling as though they were able to engage and grow in whatever direction they grow.
So many times, it's also just a lack of exposure and a lack of understanding. I think it's important to have those honest conversations and let people, as you said, express themselves, because you don't want to be shutting opinions that you disagree with down either, because that's not really like a learning environment either.
You want to be honest, and sometimes that honesty can be uncomfortable. And can be challenging and can be upsetting and can require a great deal of introspection after the fact and reflection after the fact. But if you don't start with that degree of vulnerability, and if the conditions in which you are placed, if the professor or whomever doesn't create that kind of environment, then growth won't happen. And I just really try to always strive for everybody to grow as much as possible. And you can't reach everyone. That's just the fact of what we do. I'm sure But I always try to make sure that students come into my class knowing that if they feel they're saying the wrong thing, or if they feel they're saying the absolute right thing, no matter where you fall on that spectrum, that there's always growth to be had.
Was there anything else that you kind of wanted to talk about? Anything else on your mind?
I don't know. I mean, I have a couple of quotes that I thought I could leave with or end off with just because they're meaningful to me. But beyond that, I've just really enjoyed the conversation and the kind of bridge work that's happening and what y'all are doing with, elevating and amplifying my voice, but also the voices of so many people in the academy, queer, trans people that don't often receive the kind of exposure that I think that they deserve. But other than that, I just have a couple of quotes if you want me to kind of leave off with those.
Of course.
So one of them is from Hilton Isles. And so I just really like this one, speaking of queer and queerness. It's the queers who made me, who gave me indirectly my full queer self, the desire to say I once again. And as I mentioned, kind of that idea of claiming the I think is really important for queer people and queer academics and queer students at, all levels in the academy, to be able to say I and bring all of who I am into every space, I think is really, really important. And then the last one I share with just about everyone I encounter. So you are being added to that illustrious list. But this comes from someone who I study a lot, and it's kind of, as academics, humanities scholars, academics, we often have like our person that we study and we kind of always read and come back to in some way, shape, or form. And so this is Tennessee Williams, who's, I guess you would say, my dude. And it's been so meaningful to me in many contexts in my life, and I've shared it with people for whom it has proven to be meaningful. And so for you and for whomever might watch this one day, I hope it will be meaningful for them. This is Tennessee Williams. The world is violent and mercurial. It will have its way with you. We are saved only by love for each other, and the love that we pour into the art we feel compelled to share. Being a parent, being a writer, being a painter, being a friend, we live in a perpetually burning building, and what we must save from it all the time is love. And so I would love for everyone, if you're queer and trans, you belong in the Academy, and love each other and keep doing the good queer work.
Thank you again so much for doing
I
this.
appreciate this.